Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Maria Espinola, and I am a clinical psychologist. In this channel, I share free wellness tips in English and Spanish. Today's topic is a very difficult one. We're going to discuss youth suicide awareness and prevention. My guest today is Mrs. Linda Pacha. Mrs. Pacha is an attorney, an author, and the founder and president of Nick's Network of Hope. She has first-hand knowledge of the devastation caused by a loved one's suicide. In 2013, her teenage son, Nick, died by suicide while away at college. She's the author of Saving Ourselves from Suicide, Before and After, How to Ask for Help, Recognize warning signs, and navigate grief. Today's video is meant for parents, educators, school administrators, and anybody who wants to promote children's safety.
When we formed Nick's Network of Hope, it was, in the beginning, I just wanted to put together a website that would help people like Nick who were struggling of all ages and their families. I kept on thinking about, what that was like and envisioning my son up in his room searching for answers. And I knew well that when you're going through a crisis, you don't have the energy or the time to do the research yourself. And so I wanted to put together a site that helped people where they could just go to, and there were all kinds of links to national and local organizations right for them, right there. And so that's what we did with nicksnetworkofhope.org. And so it covers the life challenges of suicide, depression. It covers anxiety, eating disorders, substance abuse and addiction, LGBTQ issues, and others. And so I practiced law for 6 years before I had my family. And one of the things that I learned was how to do research well. So what I wanted to do is have a learn and a get help page for each one of these issues with the links, and then have a very extensive resource page that would have all kinds of resources, again, with links to national and local organizations, so that people could just get on and go. And so that's what our website is all about. So after I did the website, and we got excellent feedback on it, we were blessed to know that the site actually saved someone's life, which I talk about in our book. But I felt called for more. I was having a very strong calling to write a book. And that's when I at first I didn't really want to be honest with you, because I knew it was going to be a painful process to have to relive what we went through, and it was painful to write. But again, I kept on thinking about the people like Nick, and knowing that our family went through something very extraordinarily difficult, and that we had information that could help others. So how could you not, especially when you're getting the calling, how could you not, share that with others, and push the stigma aside, and do whatever you can so that to save other people from going through what we were going through. And so that's what I did. I wrote Saving Ourselves from Suicide, Before and After, How to Ask for Help, Recognize Warning Signs, and Navigate Grief. The book is, it's all, it's everything that we wanted to know before Nick died that would have made a difference if we had that information at our fingertips. I talk about risk factors and warning signs. That was the number one thing. I wanted people to understand that this can happen in any family. There's a real misconception that it only happens in families where there are major problems, and that's not the case. It can happen to anybody. I certainly didn't think it was going to happen in our family. So it was very important for me to explain the risk factors and the warning signs for suicide. So those are there. It's a 300-page book. The first 100 pages is Nick's story. But I don't tell it in a cathartic sort of, this is what happened to us, and just leave it at that. I give the reader a real up close look, as close as you can get without going through this horrific experience. I take them by the hand and walk them through what happened to Nick from childhood to the event. I throughout the telling of that story, I weave help throughout. I bring it back to the reader and say, now, Nick couldn't see this, but if you're going through something like this, remember X, Y, and Z. And so I do that throughout the telling of his story. And that's the first 100 pages. And unfortunately, it reads like a novel. It's fortunately for the reader because it's fast moving, but unfortunately for us because, this horrific story happened to us. And then the final 200 pages is all kinds of help. Like I said, the risk factors and warning signs I go through. I talk about our change in our perspective in parenting, what I thought was important and what I now knew was important after losing Nick. I talk about the pressures that are on our youth these days and what we can do to reduce those pressures. I talk about, there was a discussion about kindness and compassion, and I actually call people to action and explain how it's so important for us all to have that empathy, to show that kindness and have that compassion for others, that it can save lives. It does save lives when we show people kindness. And so that's what the book is about. It's on Amazon. If people go to our website, nicksnetworkofhope.org, there is a listing to all the different booksellers, and all of the proceeds from our book go back into our Nick's Network of Hope not-for-profit charity, so that we can help others and help other families and save lives.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So let's go back to that story of when you said that the website saved someone's life.
Well, I was, especially right after the website went up, I wanted everybody to know about it. So I was handing cards. I had cards printed up with the website logo and what the website was. And I was handing them out everywhere. And I actually handed it to our dog groomers place of business. And the girl at the front desk where you drop off your dog, she took a bunch and I saw her, she put them in the desk drawer at the bottom. And so the next month when I went to pick up my dog after the following grooming, she said in passing, she said, "Oh, Mrs. Pacha," she said, "I think your website saved my friend's life. Would it bother you if I told you?" And I said, "No, absolutely not." And she said that she was at work and she went on Facebook. She was the receptionist that takes in the dogs, and it was a slow day, and she wanted to just go on Facebook to kill time. And she saw a posting by one of her friends that said that this was it. He lived in the south side of Chicago. He was having all kinds of difficulties trying to make it in the world. He was estranged from his family, and he was depressed. He said, "This is it. I'm going to take my life today." Well, she saw it. She panicked because she was at work. He had mentioned something like that he wanted to do this at one other point in time, and she was able to go to his side and help him and get him to reconsider. And now she was really afraid because she was at work and she couldn't leave to go to his side. So she remembered our card in the door, the desk drawer. So she pulled it out and she took a picture of it with the name of the website and said, "Before you do anything, go to this website and she didn't hear anything that whole day. And so she was panicking, thinking, the worst. And then at the end of the workday, her friend texted her and said that he went through the website, he read a bunch of information on it, and he had decided that there was still hope and that he was going to stay here.
Wow.
And I have since then made friends with this gentleman, and I have to tell you, he is one of the kindest, sweetest individuals with so much going for him and so much potential in life that it just does my heart good to know that, and this has everything to do with this young woman, because I give all the credit to her. She knew when she went to that posting, instead of saying, oh, he's being a drama king, he's not being serious, she took what she saw, it's the see something, do something.
Yeah.
It's that. She saw it, she took it seriously, she acted immediately, and it made a difference in this man's life. So that's what we all have to do. So often when, we all see people who are struggling, and there are so many people that, and myself included, there are times when you go, oh, I don't know if I should say something. They look upset, but it could be my imagination, or, what if I'm wrong? I will be insulting that person. And we have to, as a society, get out of that and put, go against that feeling of, I could be wrong. We have to step forward and show that compassion, show that kindness, and ask the person, how are you doing? Do you need to talk? If you have any information like a website like this, hand them a card or give them the information for help. Do whatever you can to ask the person how they're doing. And that's in all of life, not just if you see somebody who's struggling, but just that smiling, that kindness. It goes a long way. I think it was Kevin Hines. He was the Golden Gate jumper. I think it's his story that he says that on the way to the bridge, he said if one person would have smiled, he wouldn't have done it. He wouldn't have jumped. And nobody did that. He passed people. They were all in their own worlds doing, whatever, thinking about what their day events were. Nobody smiled at him. And he jumped. Well, fortunately, he survived that jump, and he's here now to tell that story. But when I heard that, I thought, wow, that really just made an impression on me, that impacted me. And so, when you're in the grocery store and someone is bagging your groceries, look at them, make eye contact, ask, hey, how are you doing today? If it's a student, say, hey, how's school going? Or, how's your family? Whatever you can do just to show some kindness. I think that if we did that, the suicide rates would go down, because it's that interaction that we all need. We're all connected to one another. We all desire that compassion, that interaction, that kindness.
100%. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that message. And let's go through the risk factors. I know a lot of parents are going to be watching because they worry about that. So what can you say? From your perspective, what are the top risk factors that parents should be on the lookout for?
Well, some people get confused about the difference between risk factors and warning signs. So the way you could think is risk factors give you the heads up to start looking for warning signs. It's kind of like tornado watch versus a warning. So
Right.
if you think of it that way, people will kind of, it makes more sense. So the risk factors are, hey, the conditions are ripe to start really noticing the warning signs. And so some of the risk factors are if you were diagnosed with a mental health disorder or condition in the past, or a physical, a long-term physical illness, or a serious physical illness. I shouldn't say long-term. It doesn't have to be long-term, but a serious physical illness. And that would be because of what you're going through, the stress of that, and just how that wears on somebody. If there's you're at higher risk for suicide if there's a history of suicide in the family. There is some genetic component, but not always, certainly not always, but there is, in some cases, there are a genetic component. If there's a history of alcohol or substance abuse with the person, if they've experienced a loss of, like, it could be financial, it could be a relationship, so relational loss, it could be social loss, which is really important now when we're in COVID, because as we are socially distancing and in lockdowns from time to time, we feel that loss of our social paradigm. So that's really, that's one to really pay attention to right now, especially. And if there is a history of trauma or abuse. Before I wrote the book, I read over 100 suicide attempt survivor stories from a wonderful website called Live Through This. It is a website where there are suicide attempt survivors, and each one tells their story. And so I read those because I really wanted to make sure what I could do to write about and represent this group of people in my book. And one of the things that that I learned from reading those stories is that they were saying that often, not always, but often, if somebody suffers from a trauma or an abuse, that they go into counseling and they get put on medications. But sometimes that trauma or abuse, either they don't talk about it or it's never brought up in their counseling. And so that's never addressed. And so we have to make sure that, because it is a risk factor for suicide, that if you have experienced any sort of trauma or abuse in your past, make sure if you're going to counseling to mention that, so that that can be addressed. Another risk factor, a very common one, probably one of the most common risk factors, is hopelessness. That, people have just given up hope. And then, so those are, exposure to other suicides is a risk factor. If you have easy access to lethal means. Here, I had my son go to college. He chose the college. I didn't have him go. I misspoke. He decided to go to a university where there were bridges in downtown. And so that was a access to lethal means right there. So that he was at a higher risk for suicide. So easy access to lethal means. Previous suicide attempts put you at higher risk. Of course, that makes sense. If you have an impulsive or aggressive nature, and the thought behind that is that you would, instead of thinking everything through, just react suddenly with that decision. And an inability to access healthcare, again, something that's very important right now, with what's going on with people's jobs, losing jobs through this COVID crisis. That inability to access healthcare, people, if they're diagnosed with something, if they're going through either physical problems or mental health problems, a lot of times, that is something that's wearing on them and puts them at higher risk for suicide if they can't go and get help for it. And an unwillingness to ask for help because of the stigma that's attached to suicide. That's a risk factor. So those are some of the risk factors for suicide. And the warning signs, they're generally grouped in three different groups: verbal warning signs and emotional mood warning signs, and then behavioral warning signs. In our book, I give Nick's last text messages so that people can really hear. I mean, text messages sort of verbal, right? So that they can get a real life example of verbal warning signs. And what it sounds, and you can read specifically his words in the book, but what it sounds like, what your loved one would sound like if they were contemplating suicide, might sound something like this: I want to kill myself, which is obvious, the most obvious communication, but we often don't get that. What we get is something a little less, where we have to read between the lines. I give up, nothing matters anymore. I'm trying to remain positive, but I just, think that things are hopeless. I don't see a future with me in it. Those type of statements where there's a real resignation and defeat. That's what it sounds. Those are the verbal warning signs. Those are just examples. Emotional mood would be what your loved one would, what they would be experiencing mood-wise, what you might see, like depression, anxiety, or being very anxious and agitated at times. They can feel humiliation. Maybe they had their first sexual experience and somebody found out about it, or maybe they were caught with substance or alcohol in their room, if they're a teenager. If it's they could be feeling extreme guilt or shame. They could be being intensely lonely, profoundly lonely. A resigned to in defeat, feeling like, why go on? Total hopelessness, feeling tired, exhausted. And that would be from the depression itself, or stress that's going on, about prolonged stress, an inability to focus or to concentrate or to think. Low self-esteem. Now, in teenagers, from time to time, you'll see a low self-esteem, and that is somewhat normal at times, but this is profoundly low self-esteem that carries on. Rage, and that could be in mood swings, or it can be constant. So these are some of the emotional or mood warning signs. And as far as behavioral warning signs, these are things that your loved one would be, what you might be seeing them do, their actions. And that would be, if they're withdrawing from family and friends, just isolating themselves. Again, sometimes teenagers, I know myself, I can remember times when I would lock myself in my room and play my music, and some of that's normal. But we're talking from day to day, day in and day out, this is what the teenager is doing. You have to, really do miraculous things to get them to sit down and watch even a television program with the family. So withdrawing from family and friends, intense crying. So crying episodes that are abnormal, or just unusual for your family member. Making a circuit to say goodbye, a final goodbye. And what I would caution people, like with my son being away at college, you might see this earlier, because they're away. So, for example, my son went to see his grandmother in Kansas the summer before he died by suicide. And in hindsight, we believe he was saying goodbye to her. When he came home for spring break, he was leaving little trinkets in my room, in my office. And, I didn't think that suicide was even something that would ever happen, or that he was ever contemplating it or anything. So, I was like, hey, Nick, why don't you give your stuff to Goodwill? Why are you leaving it around my office? Well, he was thinking about what he wanted to do. In hindsight, this is what we believe. And he knew that those items would mean something to me after he passed, but I didn't know what he was doing. So, so that circuit of saying goodbye or giving away possessions could happen, earlier, especially if somebody doesn't live close to you all the time, like if they're away at school. So you might see an increase of use in drugs and alcohol because they're trying to numb their pain. You might see a change in eating habits, and that could be eating more to kind of drown their sorrows in food, using it that way, or eating less because their stomach's in a knot from all the stress. It could be from the same thing with sleep. It could be sleeping more or sleeping less. The personal hygiene could be failing. They're not showering as much. The drop in grades, you might notice a drop in grades or a performance at work, and that's because they are going through pain. The people who are having suicidal thoughts, or what we call that suicidal ideation, right? They're having problems thinking, concentrating. It could be from, just the stress that they can't keep their mind on their work. And when the grades start dropping and the performance starts slipping, then there's that humiliation that we talked about earlier. They feel like they're letting people down, or that guilt. They're feeling like, hey, my mom and dad are paying for college. I should be getting better grades, but I can't because I can't think right. Or my wife and my kids are expecting me rightfully or my husband's expecting me to help with the finances at my job, but I can't because I can't keep my mind at my work. And so I'm getting poor reviews. So this all adds into it. You also might see that that a person who's struggling is researching for ways to die. And I understand the right to privacy. I get that, and I support that. But sometimes computer searches of a history, if you can see, like if my son was, for example, searching for bridges or ways to die, if I would have checked his computer history and saw that would have been a game changer. I would have had the awareness to then be able to help him and get him the help that he needs, that he needed. So, I'm not advocating that people impinge on everybody's privacy. There's a fine line there, but take that for what it's worth. And then if somebody is taking a lot of risks, teenagers, they have their whole life ahead of them. And of course, they are not as careful in life doing activities as someone, say, my age, because, I've had the life experience of falling and slipping and, oh, I know this could hurt you. And, but for teenagers, they will show more risks. But I'm talking if all of a sudden you start seeing unusual activities, like they want to go bungee jumping, they want to go do something that would really cause harm, jump out of a plane, and this is a new interest and it's one after the other, then and then with all of these warning signs and risk factors, if you see one, I don't want parents to freak out, or family members or spouses to freak out if they see one or two. You have to really weigh it all out and look at the person, look at the individual, see how many you are seeing, and what the situation around that is. And if you are in doubt and you've seen enough of them, then bring that person in for a mental health assessment, or encourage them to go get a professional opinion on their behavior, on how they're feeling. And what is very important is that before any of this happened with my son, I know I never would have went up to my son and say, hey, Nick, are you thinking about killing yourself? Because I would have thought that would have been planting the seed. And what I've learned since then, and what people really need to understand, is that the research has shown that it does not plant the seed. So they need to go and ask them straight out. If you're concerned about a loved one, whatever age of your loved one is, you can ask, hey, are you thinking about hurting yourself? And then ask, if they say yes, ask if they have a plan. Now, you must be careful, because if they say, yes, I am contemplating suicide, or I am thinking, but I don't have a plan, don't be lured into a false sense of security and think, oh, they're not serious, because a plan could be made in seconds. So if it's yes to either one of those questions, to the first question, even if the first question alone, bring the person or ask them to have a mental health assessment, because if they say yes, if they are having thoughts of suicide, they need to have professional help. And what we all need to ask our loved ones is, or make sure that they know, is if they've had mental health issues where they have contemplated suicide, even in the past, they need to tell family members, because if they swung that low, and if they had those serious thoughts in the past, they need to have a support system of their family and friends, so that if they get to that point again, that they are there, and that the family member can keep an eye on them, and watch for those risk factors and warning signs. So that communication needs to be there. And, for all parents, just asking open-ended questions and leaning forward and listening to your kids, that's very, very valuable. As parents, we want to hear just what we need to jump in and to fix a problem for our kids. There's a real tendency to do that. I know I did that. My husband did that. I think a lot of us do that. But we need to ask those open-ended questions, and sometimes just sit back and listen. And we may not always hear what we want to hear from our kids, but what that's doing is it's opening the lines of communication so that your kids feel comfortable. And and this could apply also, and it does apply to other family members of all ages. It makes them feel comfortable that they can come to you without judgment, that you really do care. And that can save lives, that open communication, that letting them know about how you feel, that you're willing to listen to them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all of that. You really sound right now like a mental health professional already.
Well, it's just, thank you for saying that. You learn a lot by going through what we have gone through. And so I just want to take whatever we have learned, and I've learned a lot since it happened. I just want to share that with people. And sometimes coming from another parent versus a mental health professional, it can open more ears, because I go, you know what, you have a little street cred because you've been through this. Right. And so whatever I can do to share what I learned it in such a hard and difficult way. I would love to help people so that they don't have to go through what we went through, because it is some of the worst. Losing a child to suicide is some of the worst suffering that you can go through and still be alive. And so I will do anything. And the stigma is there, don't get me wrong. And it's for people who have mental health illness, they feel the stigma because people don't understand what they're going through. it's a fear-based reaction, to have judgment on something that you don't understand. And so what I've learned is that, and I don't know if I fully appreciated that before Nick died, but that stigma with a person who has a mental health issue, if they die by suicide, it doesn't go away, Dr. Espinola. What it does is it just morphs and then it attaches to the family members left behind. And so that stigma is still there. I see it. I've seen other parents who have lost their children to suicide, and their first reaction is to try to cover it up and say it was an accident, or I don't want to talk about it. This has been the worst part of life, and leave me alone. I don't want to talk. And so it is difficult, because I'd be kidding myself if I didn't think people weren't judging me. And I talk about that in the book. I am giving all the missed warning signs that we had in our family, and to say, hey, look, I didn't see this, or we didn't see that. It's a difficult thing to do. We're as parents, we want to protect our kids. That's our number one job. And my son jumped from a bridge. So yeah, there are going to be people who judge me, who don't know me, who didn't see me day in and day out, what I did for Nick, what we do for my husband, I do for our kids, for my daughter and my son. We were good parents. And so it was very important for me to come forward, to push that stigma aside, because that's part of the messaging, is that it can happen in any family. By showing the missed warning signs, I'm explaining to people that that we can all miss these warning signs. It's easy to do. That's why we have to all know the risk factors and warning signs, not just read them once and kind of put them aside, but be kind of familiar with them, so that if we start seeing them in our loved ones, we know, hey, I need to get them to a mental health professional. And that it's I wanted to also be a example for people to say, hey, look, you can go through something like this and share it so that it will help others. If we just continue to talk about this, then that's how we learn. That's how we reduce that stigma. And for the people who judge me, I understand it to some extent. And I've been through worse. So if people want to judge, they can. I've been through a heck of a lot worse. But the judging comes from, oh my gosh, I don't want this to happen in my family. I don't even want to think about it happening in my family. So I'm going to look at those parents and say, I'm going to make an assumption and say either they were lowering self-esteem, or you can't tell me one of those two weren't drinking, or something, somebody wasn't paying attention to the kids when they should have been. And they'll say, but we do, in my family, we do. So it won't happen to us. Or they'll look at my son and say, well, he was like X, Y, and Z, and our kids aren't like that. So I don't have to worry. It's not going to happen in our family. So that's how that stigma comes about. And I understand it, because it's a way of distancing the suicide and saying, yeah, it's not going to happen to us. I'm just saying it's a dangerous thing to do that, because then you won't learn the risk factors and warning signs. You won't be paying attention to the behaviors of our kids. It can happen in any family, and we have to be open to that, as frightening as that is. The suicide rates are going up, and not to scare people, but to just be put on notice that we all have to be kind and compassionate and empathetic, because this is happening all around us. So I don't need to come here today and give statistics, memorize a bunch of statistics and say it, because we all know people who are suffering. And that means a lot more than the numbers to some people, like, yeah, I know my cousin so-and-so, or my aunt so-and-so, or my child. We all know somebody who's struggling.
Absolutely. And thank you so much again for everything you're doing. You're one of my heroes.
Oh, gosh, thank you.
Really, I really admire your work because it's amazing. And you're right. I mean, that's why I felt like it was so important to have you in this platform so people can hear you instead, because I feature usually psychologists, but I think it's so important for people like you to have a platform and be
Thank
heard.
you. Thank you. And there's so much hope. There is hope through all of this. There's hope. If we do learn the risk factors and warning signs, if we do show more kindness and compassion, if we are keeping our eyes peeled and bringing our loved ones for help when they need it, then we can turn this around. We'll always have some people who make who are suffering so much and are in so much pain that they make that decision. And even when I say make that decision, I say that the words, but if you have a serious mental health problem, it's not like you're making a choice. They're in pain. What I say, what I talk about in the book is that pain, if you are alive and breathing, then you don't know what that pain is because we're still here. To make that decision, to go against that innate desire or our innate reaction to live, our drive to live and to survive, it takes a lot. It takes something that we fully can't understand because we're still here. And there's so many misconceptions about people who make the decision that they're cowards, that they are, that they lack faith, that they're selfish. And I want to say, they have an immense amount of pain on them. And I equate that to like having a piano on your chest. And it doesn't really equate, but this is at least something that people can kind of visualize.
Yeah.
If you had a piano that was on your chest, would you be thinking about your mother, your father, your spouse, your aunt, your uncle, your kids? You wouldn't. All you would be thinking is, get this piano off my chest. I can't breathe. I need oxygen. And that's what I believe these people are feeling. So it's not a selfishness. It's not cowardly. You think about all the ways that people take their lives. It's like, oh my gosh, there's got to be easier ways, right, to go on living. And a lack of faith, just in our community itself, you're always going to have people that believe and others that don't believe. And it's the same with people who take their lives. There are going to be some that are believers and some don't, just by the very nature of being a human being. But and our decisions. But the fact that someone chooses to die by suicide because of the pain, trying to get that pain off of them, I've heard people say it's a lack of faith, and I don't agree with that. I just don't agree with that at all. I talk with a lot of families who have lost kids to suicide, because I help families, other family members, get through their grief as much as I can by sharing how I was able to work through my grief. And I'll ask, and they'll say, no, my child or my spouse, they had strong faith. It wasn't a lack of faith. I can tell you my son had strong faith. So it's not, that's just a misconception I think that people have.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And to the analogy of the piano, I would add that is the sensation of having the piano on top and the feeling that will never go away.
It will
That
never
is
go away.
but yes,
It's that
because like
hopelessness.
the hopelessness, yes, which you mentioned.
Yeah.
And that is the number one risk factor, hopelessness, more than depression and more than any other factor. Actually, I have treated so many people with so many different horrific histories of trauma, and then others who didn't have trauma but they still felt suicidal. And the ones that are highest risk, the ones who actually went on to attempt, thankfully I never had a patient so far but who committed suicide, but the ones who I treated who attempted in the past were the ones who had lost hope.
Lost
And the treatment, yeah, and the treatment, the number one thing in the treatment, number one thing that I focused on was on increasing that hope, increasing
I
the meaning of life.
completely agree with you. I think that's the number one, you call it risk factor or warning sign. The warning sign, I think it's number one. And that's why I named our not-for-profit charity, Nick's Network of Hope. That's why our book, even though it's saving ourselves from suicide before and after, so it's for people who are wanting to help somebody or themselves through a tough time so that they don't get to that point. And it's also for people who've gone through a suicide and are dealing with the aftermath, and they need help getting through the grief process. So yeah, and I talk, and it's a very hopeful book, even though it's a tough topic to talk about. It's a very hopeful book. And the other thing that I really want to stress for people is that, my son was bullied from the time he was a little kid. And I don't know if he was physically bullied. He never came to us to say that, but I know verbally with snide remarks, and he was made fun of. He was we think he was high functioning Asperger's. And so he was, I would say, quirky, didn't come off as weird or strange, but quirky, like pleasantly quirky, a very sweet, gentle soul. And so he was an easy target. And he was bullied from the time he was in grade school. And what I would, for mental health professionals, what they need to consider is that, traditional bullying, we know what that looks like. But what I'd like to add to that is exclusions, being excluded over like a prolonged period of time, constantly being excluded from a group over and over and over again. What happens with the person who's having social difficulties, when they've experienced that over and over and over, they stop seeing that they are being excluded from a certain activity on a certain day at a certain time. They start seeing all of these exclusions as a personal rejection of them, their entire being. And so to Billy, who didn't invite Bobby because, to play at his house at 3:00 on Wednesday, to Billy, in Billy's mind, he just told Bobby he didn't, include him with the rest of the kids. It's no big deal. But to that young man who's been excluded over and over and over again, it's almost a form of bullying, because it's causing a pain that has been stacked up from exclusion upon exclusion. That pain that's underneath is festering, and it is deep. And it over a period of time, it gets deeper and deeper. And so kids may not know, and this is for grown-ups too, we may not know when we see a person what their history is, how much they've been bullied in the past, how much they've been excluded in the past, so that they're seeing these actions as personal rejections to them. And so that is a very, very important thing that we need to start teaching kids from a very young age, to be in tune with that not everything's at face value, that they need to have that kindness and compassion, those lessons at a young age in schools, so that they have that on their minds, that, hey, I see so-and-so, one of my friends, sitting alone at the lunch table day after day after day. I need to help them, because that has to be painful for them to be sitting alone every day. In my book, I talk about how in schools, lunchtime and gym time are two of the most difficult periods for a child who has social difficulties. Because for an hour at lunch, they don't know where to sit. They're sitting alone. I know my son, this was an awful, excruciating period in his day. Often he would either take his lunch and eat in the bathroom, or he'd go to one of the school counselor's office. he'd sit alone, and it was agonizing for him. And then for kids, I talk about this, and I then encourage schools to have different programs for their lunchtime, for how they place their tables. I give examples of different programs they can have so that these kids can be included and assimilated with their peers. And likewise, after these kids go to lunch, they go to gym, and for many of the gym classes, the teams are chosen, and they're chosen how they have always been chosen, traditionally, where there are kids at the front, usually two of the most athletic or cool kids, and a lot of times that goes hand in hand, and they're yelling who they want to be on their team, and it's usually the athletic or the cooler kids, and the kids who socially struggle their names aren't yelled, or they're to the very end, or they're yelled like, don't pick Billy because Billy sucks, or Billy is terrible. And it's just, it's to Billy, he's hearing that, and he just sat alone for an hour at lunch. And so I encourage schools for picking teams to have a software program. And if there's not one, make one where they take the kids' skill levels and, for the sport, and they make teams so that they're equal teams from different skill levels, but that's not, it's not known that, okay, Billy's not the socially, it's not advertised by the gym instructor, but, so that they just post lists of, okay, these are the people on this team, this is the people on this team. And so it saves these kids who are socially awkward or not athletically inclined. And a lot of times that goes hand in hand. It saves them from a lot of humiliation. So it's the bullying, it's the exclusion, it's this sort of humiliation and being isolated from day to day that is wearing on these kids. And that we must be aware of this. The schools need to be aware of it. The kids need to be taught that these kids could be experiencing this. Have the discussions in an age appropriate way from the time kids, and the mental health professionals will know when it's an age appropriate time, but talk about mental health in grade school, what that feels like, or at least by middle school, because we have middle schoolers who are taking their lives now. We hear it all across our country. We just had one in town this past summer, a little middle school girl who took her life. So in my hometown. So start talking at least by middle school about mental health, what that is, what it's like what it feels like if it starts slipping. Start talking about the kids about warning signs and so that they know if they start recognizing those signs in themselves or their peers, and have those discussions. Hey, if you notice this in one of your friends, what do you do about that? Because kids will have the tendency to go and express their feelings, like, if they're experiencing mental health issues, to another peer more than going to a coach or a teacher or a parent. And so I think the schools need to equip the kids with enough information without scaring them, to at least have that dialogue open and the communications started, and then direct them on what to do, that they should then go to an adult, to somebody who can help.
Absolutely. Yeah. I really like the ideas that you share on the book, and I think that are fundamental. And I like the fact that you mentioned exclusion, because bullying is a very, very traumatic experience. And I will share in the video more of the consequences of bullying. And exclusion is something that people don't usually talk about at all, but it's something that I always assess patients for. So like where they have been bullied or excluded, and how many friends do they have, and how much do they trust them, and how often do they see them. All of that can give you an idea of what may be going on.
Yeah, and it can be exclusions at all ages. It could be, you know,
Yeah.
your peers at work are going out for a beer after work and they don't ask you.
Right.
Yeah, you know, or the girls are getting together for lunch, your girlfriends, but they didn't bother to ask you. Uh, uh, um, there's exclusions at every level, at every age.
Yeah.
And if a person was bullied in their childhood and then they are experiencing those exclusions as they age, you know, it's not a fresh exclusion. You're carrying that bullying history with you, and then it's exclusion on top of that pain. And so that pain can sometimes fester and get so deep that it becomes what I say as a mortal wound, that being and could lead to suicide.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
again, it goes back to being aware of all of this, talking about it, and then for all of us to be more cognizant of others and their needs as well as our own needs, and to show kindness, compassion. It all works together.
Yes. Yeah. And regarding what you said, how early to speak about mental health for children, I know that many schools are using social emotional learning now very early on, even in kindergarten. And that's something that I definitely, I'm a big advocate for. It's just, it has been found that helps children regulate themselves and be kind to themselves and to others, promote compassion, reduces the amount of suspensions that children have, and yeah, so in behavioral issues altogether, including bullying. But yeah, I will be sharing some of that on the video as well.
Some schools are doing such a great job with it. They're doing so many programs. It needs to be more consistent throughout the country, our country, the world, really, right? Never more than now do we understand, do we feel a brotherhood to people across the world. As we're all going through COVID together, we realize, hey, you know what? We're going through all the same issues at the same time. I think that it was a real awakening to seeing past our own lives and seeing a wider scope of the needs of the world and the caring for the world.
Absolutely, I agree.
In the world,
I agree. Yes. I wanted to ask you about, in the book you mentioned LGBT issues. You'd be comfortable talking more about that?
Sure. So my son, like I said, when he was younger, he was going through bullying and exclusion, social issues. And then when he was a junior in high school, he came to me and said that he thought that he was gay. And I hugged him and I said to him, "Oh, Nick, you know, I was very supportive and loving, and made sure he knew that that both my husband and I, and my husband did the same thing. It was both of us that, you know, we loved and supported him, and my daughter as well. Our whole family did. So he knew that our immediate family, our extended family, loved him and accepted. And even saying accepted, that word kind of, even as it comes out of my mouth, gives me a little bit of a, because to say you accept something is as if it's something was wrong. So I don't mean it in that way. I mean, we loved him, embraced him is a better word. But for Nick, it was a real internal struggle. He wasn't okay with questioning his sexuality. He wanted to be like every other kid that he saw at school. In his mind, they were all straight, and he wanted to have that same thing where he had attractions for females. And so for my son, he appreciated our love and support, but it was very difficult for him. And then like a month later, he came back and he said to us, you know, I don't think I'm gay. I think I'm straight, because I don't have feelings for guys either. And so he would flip-flop from one to the other, not understanding why, and it bothered him. He didn't share it at school. He didn't tell anybody, but the kids, I think, picked up on it. And they started to bully him about that. One day he was in band, and two girls yelled across the band, "Nick, are you gay?" Nick said no, and they said, "We find that hard to believe," and they started laughing. And then some of the other band kids started laughing. And it was just awful, Dr. Espinola. Nick came home, he was crying. We called the mom to one of the girls, the mom of one of the girls that said that. And she promised the kids wouldn't say anything at school afterwards. Her kids wouldn't. And sure enough, it got back to the kids at school. Nick and I knew that was a possibility, but we were desperate. He was so upset over it. I had to try to get it to stop. Unfortunately, it backfired by me calling one of the moms with Nick, and my kids wound up quitting band. And so around the same time that Nick was going through this, he gave away some clothes. And I opened his closet one day, was doing laundry, and I looked in and I saw that a lot of his clothes were missing. And my husband and I sat down with Nick and we said, we asked him about it. What's this all about? He said that he felt good giving his clothes away. He said, "Mom, Dad, you've given me so much, and I have a lot, and other people are out there who don't." So he wanted to give some of his items to other people. But it wasn't just a little bit, it was quite a bit. Now, I did not know the risk factors or warning signs for suicide at the time, but I did know that one, giving away your possessions was a warning sign. So if you would have known Nick, he truly was the kindest and sweetest person I've ever met in my life. I say that. My husband says that. We say that to this day. So hearing that explanation from him, was a possibility. It was plausible, but being that it could also be a risk factor for a warning sign for suicide, we brought him to two psychologists for a first and second opinion. Both of them assessed him. They did not think he was suicidal. That one psychologist thought he was the highest functioning Asperger's kid he had ever seen. And so I'll tell you that it was like the perfect storm, like what was going on, because we had with Nick questioning himself, getting bullied for that. And then you can tell that it was really bothering him because he was giving away clothes. So it must have pushed him. That pain must have gone to that level where he was contemplating suicide. I do think he was, even though he somehow, after going to the psychologist did not think so. In hindsight, I think he was. Well, it's a real possibility that he was, especially since he died freshman year in college. So it wasn't soon after that. It wasn't too long after that. But the LGBTQ issue is very difficult because in hindsight, we believe Nick was asexual because he didn't have feelings for males or females. And what I would like to share with people on that is that they need to be aware and to teach their kids that these issues are very private and personal. And it's not like, you wake up and you know who you are sometimes. I mean, I knew I was straight from the time I remember. I write in the book how I used to take my the rug in kindergarten during nap time, and I tried to get it by Tommy House. So I knew that I was straight from my earliest memory, at least by kindergarten, right? But that's not always the case with people. Sometimes people need more time to figure out where they are on that sexuality spectrum. And so it's a private, personal matter. And sometimes it's a difficult a period of time when for people to figure that out, and it could cause a lot of pain, internal pain, as they do work through it, try to understand their feelings. And so nobody should try to out somebody else. Like when those two girls yelled to Nick, "Are you gay?" Nobody should ever do that. And laughing, that's bullying. Their response when Nick said no, "We find that hard to believe," and they started laughing, that's bullying in the most extreme form. So we have to teach our youth that the words have meaning and actions have consequences, and nobody should try to out anybody else, because that is a personal, private matter that should only be brought up by an individual if they choose to, and then it should be on their terms. And we need to be respectful of that. And we need to be loving and kind and accepting of others, wherever they are on the spectrum, because we are all human beings. We are all worthy of being loved and cared for, and people are different.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I appreciate the fact that you mentioned that in the book, and you had a whole section on the topic. You also have more resources on the website. So that's wonderful, because it is, unfortunately, LGBT youth is one of the highest risk populations for suicide. So it's really important to be on the lookout for that.
And it played in my son's suicide for sure, because so senior year, we had him going to one of the psychologists, and the plan was to have him see the psychologist because he gave away those clothes. We wanted him to go see the psychologist for all the way up until he went to college. That was the plan. But Nick was, it was like pulling teeth. He kept on telling us that he was fine, that, Mom, Dad, my grades aren't slipping. I'm doing well in school. I'm telling you I'm okay. I'm telling you I'm not suicidal. You've had not one, but two psychologists tell you that I'm not suicidal. I don't think I need to see anybody. But we were like, Nick, just go until college. And he came home one day and said the one thing that would stop us from sending him back to that psychologist. He said he thought that guy was hitting on him during a session. And so, it was creative. I'll give my son that. And he was not a manipulative kid. He had never pulled anything like that before. He never lied to us. So that just showed how desperate he was, that he didn't want to go, that he would kind of stoop to that level to say that. So we couldn't take the chance. We didn't think it was happening. We had checked out this guy before we sent him the first time, and we thought he was, he had good reputation, and we didn't think it was happening, but we couldn't take that chance. We couldn't send him behind locked doors as a minor, and just, take a chance. So we said, okay, you don't have to go back to him, but pick somebody else, or we'll pick somebody, but you need to go. And he just kicked and screamed about it, didn't want to go. And he said, again, my grades are fine. I'm doing well. I'm telling you, I'm not suicidal. Two psychologists just told you. And so we said, okay, fine. And at some point we didn't want to lower his self-esteem, because when your kids are saying to you, oh, I'm okay. And, you don't want to lower their self-esteem and say, oh, we don't think you are. We think you're messed up. We want you to go and keep on going. And so we didn't want to do that. And so he finished out his senior year, and he got to college. He was put on a floor through university housing, matched up with a roommate that was into smoking pot and playing computer games. And Nick was not judging him, but he really wasn't into either of those things. And unfortunately, the guys on the floor in the surrounding rooms were also into those two things. And so they all hit it off, but Nick was the outsider once again. So here we go with the exclusions. And it's not fresh new exclusions. Again, as we talked about, it's that history that follows you. And so those exclusions, there were already that pain that was festering from years of being bullied and being excluded, and now it was happening again. And then the last weekend, my son called home. Nick said, he called me up and said, "Mom, I'm having the worst weekend of my life. There's a rumor going around that I'm gay and the guys are laughing." And he goes, "I don't even know for myself. I never shared anything with them." And he says, "And they're just saying that I am, and they're laughing and making fun of him." And so I flew out there right away. He was at the University of Minnesota. I flew out there. There was a hotel on campus. And the plan was for me to stay there. It was just 2 weeks before the end of the first year of school, that freshman year. And the plan was for me to stay there those 2 weeks. And then he could get off the floor from where the bullying was happening, study for finals, keep his mind then, on his studies. And then we would fly home after he finished his finals and then drive back and pick up his stuff. And so I talked to him that whole weekend and got him to the point where he was laughing and feeling good. And then it was a Saturday when I got there. So I talked to him all the way till, Monday morning. He woke up and he had Monday morning classes, said goodbye. I thought he was going to be going to class. And instead of doing that, he jumped off a bridge. And there's more to that, which I discuss in the book. Yeah. So that bullying, I couldn't believe my son was in college and he was being bullied again. And that ultimate act of bullying him about sexuality was like one of the last straws. It wasn't, I will never say, that caused it, because you got to consider everything that happened throughout his life. There was no one thing that caused it. It was all of it that had just grew and festered to that point. But you think when you send your kid to college that they're grown up and the kids are going to be respectful of one another. I could not believe he was being bullied in college.
Yeah, and I appreciate reading all those details in the book, because it kind of like, I think once again, it's what you were saying. It's just, you were good parents. Like, you did everything in your power to prevent this from happening, and it still happened. So I think, I think that's why the book and the website and now this talk are so helpful, because you're basically know from your own experience everything a parent needs to do, and then also now looking back and what you learn after allow you to have a wider, more comprehensive perspective of everything that others can do in similar situations. And then there are things that are not up to individual people, are systemic changes that you discuss in the book, and I think are so fundamental in terms of changing the way schools manage these things. So one, we discussed already the issues with the school lunches and the physical activity time. But then you also mentioned in the book changes that you would like to see in terms of how colleges manage these type of situations. I don't know if you want to expand
About
on
colleges?
that. Yeah.
Well, for example, we didn't know when my son went to college, there was, parent orientation, and they talked a lot about mental health and depression, and so much so that I turned to my husband. I'm like, wow, this really, really must be a big problem in colleges, because they're really, talking a lot about it. Well, I didn't know that there was a history of students jumping from those bridges in the downtown area. And, that would have been good to know. that, and I understand that, for a college, they want to not scare the parents away, or have them tell other potential parents about prospective parents, so that they don't choose that school. But there's a real line there that, people should be made aware of the potentials, the possibilities, the history of what's happened, so that they could understand to protect their children. And so that information I would have appreciated knowing. That the colleges, there definitely needs to be more, there needs to be more mental health counselors available, and that comes with funding. That there are a lot of colleges that don't have enough funding to hire the counselors for all of their student body. And because we're having such a problem with depression, and the numbers are going up, and the numbers of suicides are going up. I mean, it's, suicide is the second leading cause of death between the ages of 10 and 34. So we have to have more counselors in the schools at all levels, at all age levels. So that's information that, so that's a change that could be done, is to make sure that the kids also are aware that if they see a counselor that, if, for example, like in high school, if you go see the student counselor, let the kids know it's not going to be on your permanent record. Excuse me. It's not going to follow you into college. So, because I think some kids are afraid to go to the school counselor because they're afraid to be seen. They're afraid that it's going to go in a file that will damage their record. And if they're afraid to be seen, well, you can have virtual sessions and have those available for your college students, or your high school students, or your middle school students. Have virtual counselors, or the counselors have virtual sessions, or, so that the kids, if they're afraid of being seen, they don't have to worry about that. They can do it by, virtually by their computers. Now, more than ever with COVID, we understand how virtual meetings, virtual counseling sessions, they're very valuable, and it offers people the opportunity to get the help they need, where they might, because of the stigma, not want to take that step. This takes away, you don't have to worry about other students seeing you, or
Right.
So have that available, and also have the communication that it's not going to go on a permanent record someplace where it's going to follow you, so that the kids don't feel like they can't do that without jeopardizing their academics or their careers.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I definitely agree with that. And then that's the other reason why I like social emotional learning, because that is given to everybody. Right? So there's not a stigma. If everybody's getting it, there's no stigma. In the same way, that's why I'm a big advocate for integrated care, things like physical and mental health care at the same time.
Yeah.
Because that way it's just like for every patient.
For everybody, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right. And, it's part of the in-service education. As a lawyer, I have to do continuing education. And so as part of the continuing education program, or their in-service education, have the teachers learn the risk factors and warning signs for suicide. If they haven't already done it, I'm sure that it's not done throughout our country consistently. There might be some schools doing that, but just as every parent needs to know that, every person really needs to know that, so that even if they're single, and they need to know the risk factors and warning signs for themselves, for their coworkers, for their nieces and nephews. So everybody needs to know the risk factors and warning signs. So let's have in the educational system, let's make sure our teachers are equipped with that knowledge. Let them, as part of their training, let them become aware of the risk factors and the warning signs, so that they can see those and be have their eyes peeled for looking for those risk factors and warning signs with their students. have more education on suicide prevention at every level in the schools. And I think that would definitely help. If we're all looking for these signs, then it will make a difference.
Absolutely, I agree.
It was very important that in our book that I mentioned, or as for topics of discussion, we covered suicide prevention and grief and loss, which is unusual to find in one book. But the reason why I did that is that I've learned that those issues really overlap. After Nick died, and when I was writing the book, I wanted to join some of the Facebook groups, the private Facebook groups for suicide loss survivor families. So those are families where a family member has died by suicide. And what I found was that in those chat rooms, in those discussions, that a lot of those members, many were suicidal themselves. And so that really made an impression on me. And then I worked with a family where after they lost their son, like within a year and a half, the father then hung himself. And so, it's very important that people who've gone through grief understand, that are going through it, that it's such an intense process, such an arduous process, that they themselves can be at risk for suicide. And knowing the risk factors and warning signs is important for them also, so that they can see within themselves if they, or their family members, if they are having thoughts of harm. And then for people who are depressed, I thought it was a very good idea to have in this book, then have them read what it's like for their family if they chose to die by suicide, what their family would be going through. So when I discuss the grief process and everything that we had to go from, not wanting to leave our house to go get groceries, having to answer the difficult questions, the understanding of the stigma, the awareness, the understanding, then the acceptance of the stigma, and having to deal with that every day, that these are things that would help somebody who's contemplating, they can consider that and say, I don't want my family. That might be the thing that keeps them here. They might say, I don't want to put my family through that. And sure enough, I have a friend whose son, who is now an adult, shared with her that when he was in his teen years, he himself was suicidal. And he said, Mom, he goes, the thing that kept me here was I didn't want to put you and Dad through all that. And so that's why it was very important for me to have both topics in one book. And so when people see that, if they are depressed, when they get to that portion, don't skip that, read it, because it might help them understand what would happen to their families. And for people who are grieving, if they see Saving Ourselves from Suicide, I had to put in before and after, because I didn't want them to get the book or have somebody give them the book and be like, well, what the heck? It's already happened. It's kind of a slap in the face. No, this is going to help you with your grief, but it will also help you with your family members in case they're going through some of these other emotions that can lead to suicide. Again, those warning signs, the emotional mood would be depression. You're going through a big, major grief or loss, which, by the way, is a risk factor for suicide. So we didn't talk about that, but it's one of the risk factors. And then just feeling hopeless, and I could tell you, as being a parent who lost her child, there were moments when it was like, what am I waking up to? Where's the joy in my life ever going to be? Where's there going to be hope? And so that's what I try to share in the book, is that there is joy in life still. There is hope. It's a choice every day I wake up, but it's there. And so that's why it was very important for me to cover both of those topics in one book.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I noticed that in the book and I really appreciate it. I think it's already helpful to so many people, but it's gonna be continue to be helpful as more people become aware of the book and what it contains, right? It's just like a lot of amazing information. Yeah, so thank you so much. This
Welcome.
has
I'm sure
been like
there's a lot of information there. Yeah, and I didn't talk about the faith component, but if you want me to, I will. If there's anybody who does it, I just, the faith is the thing that got us through through our grief, was our reliance on our faith. It was probably the biggest thing. It definitely was the biggest thing that helped us get through it, was just our faith that we know we will see Nick again. And we had to, my paradigm of faith, I always had strong faith from the time I was very young, but after losing Nick, I call it my Rubik's Cube of faith. It just went out of sync completely. And, in the very beginning, I didn't want to pray to God. I was angry. And it didn't last long. I knew we would be okay. It didn't make me lose my faith, but I was angry like you would be at your closest friend. Like if they really betrayed you, that's kind of the feeling that I had. Like I knew we would be okay, but we weren't okay right then. And so, there was a day really early on where I got down on my hands and knees and was pounding the floor. Like, why did you let this happen? Why did you let this happen? I was saying my prayers. I was asking for help. I knew that he was going through a tough time. Why did you let me down? And then right away, I think because I was open to receiving grace, that Rubik's Cube of faith started to sink back and go back in alignment. And I know I wasn't doing it. It was coming from above. And so I started out really not wanting to pray. When I went to church, I didn't even want to lift the part of the mass or anything. But I went because I wanted to get back square with God, in my mind, have him be square with me with him. And I came to realize that, I will never know all the answers, that there is a bigger picture. And that's what my faith is. What our faith is, if people have faith in a higher being, is sometimes we won't know all of the answers. We have to have trust in our higher being. We have to have the faith that we will someday see the bigger picture. But God is not a punishing, sadistic, like, oh, let's see how she'll handle this. There's things that happen for reasons that we will never ever understand, and then free will and all that. And I just knew that I would take baby steps. What I remembered was God was good, God was loving, and that those, I hung on to those two core concepts, that God was good and God was loving. And then I started seeing more signs, and I was filled with grace. I had a lot of people that I had to forgive, including myself, for missing warning signs, my husband for missing warning signs, my daughter. We all had to forgive ourselves, because I don't care who you are, we all, after a suicide, we beat ourselves up. How did we miss this? What could we have done differently? And that is part of the process. And it is part of the cleansing of this, that you just have to accept there is no one thing that causes a suicide, and that we do the best that we can. And if we loved our loved ones, then that's enough. If we've done all that we can, we have to let it go and move forward. And so we forgave ourselves, because nobody's perfect. We all missed signs, and we had to understand our human nature, that we're not perfect human beings with a crystal ball. We don't live like that. And then we had to forgive others who were unkind to Nick, my son's personal bullies. And especially with the youth, I look back at, hey, there were times I wasn't a stellar teenager, that I made comments, or I had conversations that could have hurt somebody. That's part of the growing up process, the maturity. And so I had to cut some of those people, all those people, slack. And even the adults, there were some adults that were less than kind to my son. And I had to just say, you know what? None of us are perfect. And it's part of the growing process. We're all here to learn our lessons and to grow in faith and in love. And so it's part of the process. And I had to forgive those people, because I'm not perfect. None of us are. And so I expect to be forgiven for the things that I do in the world. And the things that are some of the actions that we do that we're not proud of. I hope that I'm forgiven. So I need to do that with the other people too. And so that forgiveness, that also came from grace, that that I was given the grace, I believe, from above for that level of forgiveness. I talk in the book how when I was young and had my kids, that as a young mom, I'd watch Oprah on the TV, where the kids would be playing in the family room. And there were some episodes, where she'd have shows where she had parents on and their kids were murdered. And the parents would be like, oh, I forgave him for shooting my kid or strangling him or whatever it was. And then I would think, oh my gosh, I don't know if I have that in me. I don't think I could ever do that. I understand that now. I couldn't then, because I never had to forgive at that level. But some of the people, like the person that spread the rumor around, for my son, or some of all this like added to it, I had to forgive. And it took a type of forgiveness that I didn't have to do in the past, not at that level. And it was because I was given grace to do that forgiveness, that maybe I didn't need that grace back then, because this was much at a different level of forgiveness, but I had it. And I am no different than anybody else in the world, that, that grace is for all of us, that it's kind of a cool thing to know that when you need those special graces, that we all, first of all, have the grace for forgiveness, and we do that so that we can move on, and that we can still be loving people, not carry that anger and have that fester in us. But that we all have that in us, that grace, and that if we ever need it to be at a higher level of forgiveness, or for anything that we need, all we have to do is be open for it, and we're given that grace to do it. So that is another message that I give to people, is that we're very loved. We're very loved from our higher being, and that we are given what we need to get through the most difficult times.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
So when I was reading the stories from suicide attempt survivors on livethroughthis.org, another thing that I learned from them is that the attempt survivors said that their safety plans really helped them. And I didn't know what a safety plan was. So I have since learned that what a safety plan is that you would sit down either with your parent if you're a teenager, or somebody that you trust. It may not be your parents, it could be your coach or a teacher or an aunt or uncle, or if you're a spouse, it could be with your other spouse. But you sit down with somebody that you trust, and you write a plan to help you when you are struggling and you're spiraling down and you feel yourself sort of losing it. Then you pull out your safety plan. And the idea is you pull out your safety plan instead of going to a suicide plan. And the suicide attempt survivor stories say that suicide attempt survivors say that those plans really do help them. The plan, so you sit down with somebody you trust, and you write down all the names of the people who support you, who care for you, that your parents, your aunts, uncles, cousins, friends, and you write down how you can get a hold of them quickly, their phone numbers, their emails, their for text messages, however, and you write all that down. And that gives you a quick access to these people if you're spiraling, but also a reminder of all the people who care for you. Then you write down emergency numbers. If you go on our website, nextnetworkofhope.org, we have a lot of the prevention lifeline numbers, so you can take it right from there. So you write down the emergency numbers. You'd also add local hospitals, local clinics, whatever, so that if you are spiraling down and need to call somebody quickly, you have it right there at your fingertips. And then you write down a section where positive things that will help keep you here, reminders for you. So you will mention things like future goals, wanting to go to Cancun when we can travel again, getting into junior college, getting into college, getting married, getting this new job promotion. You write down all the positive things that help you, like eating healthy, taking your medications, going to counseling, not missing an appointment, the songs that you like. So all the positive things that will help keep you here. You can do pictures. You can put a picture of your dog, if that's something that, somebody who would keep you here that you remember, a picture of your little sister or your big brother. So you do all this in a section so that you are reminded of all the positive things in your life, what you have to do to feel good, and the things that are important to you. And then there's a section where you write the things to stay away from. And that could be toxic people in your life. It could be, substances and alcohol, as a reminder to not numb your pain in that way, but to do the things in the paragraph above, which were the positive things, which you'll include the healthy ways to cope with stress, like exercising, meditating, reading books, music. It might be something like not looking at old pictures. If you have gone through a painful divorce, then that's a reminder, hey, you know what? Let's not go through and look through old family pictures, because that is a trigger for me. And so you're going to write down all the things that have a negative impact on you. It could be watching the news, limiting how much exposure you have to negativity that way. And again, especially now, if it causes you anxiety or fear, you may not want to do that right now when you feel yourself spiraling. So this is something in writing, and you have it all set out there, because we all know that when we are spiraling out of control, or you feel yourself slipping into an unhealthy headspace, we're not thinking clearly. We're having a difficult time concentrating. We're having problems motivating ourselves. Our memory is a little skewed. So you can pull out your safety plan, and you might very well want to ask the person who helped you make the safety plan, help you implement those things. They are already aware of what's on there because they helped you make it, and they're kind of your buddy to help you implement. If you don't have someone like that, you could certainly do it by yourself because it is right there for you in black and white. But that is something that you want to do. And really, I think it's a good idea for everybody who, for parents to have a safety plan with their kids, just like you would have a safety plan if your house caught on fire. What would we do? Where would we meet? We'd meet over at Mr. and Mrs. Smith's house. We would know that we were all okay. You have a fire plan. Well, this is the same thing, a safety plan. I wouldn't hang it on the refrigerator or anything like that, because that's like saying, like we're afraid of Timmy's mental health, flashing it on the refrigerator every day for Timmy, every time he goes in to grab an apple. It's not a healthy thing. Put it in a drawer in a folder someplace, but have it so that, it's an easy access. And if you're worried about a child and having a difficult time having them do this activity with you, it might be helpful if you say, you know what, we're going to do it with all the kids. We're going to have a safety plan, and mom's going to do one and dad's going to do one. It's a way to get people to do it.